The whispers followed Ruby O'Malley everywhere in Canon City, Colorado. They trailed behind her like shadows, persistent and dark, even on the brightest days when the sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty Main Street. Simple, they called her, though never to her face, at least not when her brother Patrick was within earshot. The townsfolk weren't brave enough for that. It was 1876, the year Colorado would achieve statehood, though such political matters seemed distant concerns to Ruby. At 22, she lived in a world defined by boundaries others had drawn for her. Her days consisted of helping at the general store her brother had inherited from their parents, tending to her small garden behind their modest home, and avoiding the stares and whispers. Ruby wasn't simple-minded as the town claimed. She simply experienced the world differently. Colors were more vibrant to her, sounds more intense. Sometimes words got tangled up inside her head before they could reach her mouth, and crowds made her feel like she was drowning on dry land. But she understood things others didn't, like the language of animals, the patterns of weather in the mountains, and the true nature of people hidden beneath their pleasant smiles. The townsfolk never bothered to look deeper. To them, her quietness was proof of a deficiency. Her occasional outbursts when overwhelmed were evidence of an unstable mind. Her preference for the company of animals over most people was just another peculiarity that marked her as different. Patrick protected her as best he could, but even he didn't truly understand. He loved her fiercely, but sometimes love isn't enough to bridge the gap of comprehension. Ruby's life in Canon City might have continued in this limited fashion indefinitely if not for the day Ethan Wilcox rode into town. It was a Tuesday in early June when the stranger arrived, the kind of day when summer heat had begun to settle into the valley. Ruby was sweeping the boardwalk in front of O'Malley's general store when she heard the steady clop of hooves approaching from the east. The man who guided his chestnut mare down Main Street sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders squared against the glaring sun. Dust clung to his clothes, a testament to days on the trail, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of quiet confidence rather than weariness. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat brim, but Ruby could make out a strong jawline darkened by several days' growth of beard. What caught Ruby's attention, however, wasn't his appearance but the way he handled his horse. His hands were gentle on the reins, his legs offering subtle guidance rather than harsh commands. The mare responded to him with the easy trust that comes from mutual respect. As he passed the general store, the stranger's eyes met Ruby's. They were an unexpected blue, bright against his sun-browned skin. He touched the brim of his hat in a polite greeting, and Ruby froze, her hands tightening on the broom handle. She wasn't accustomed to being acknowledged so directly by strangers. She managed a small nod in return, then quickly lowered her gaze to the wooden planks beneath her feet. By the time she dared look up again, the stranger had continued down the street toward the Rusty Nail Saloon. "Ruby," Patrick's voice came from inside the store. "I need you to help with the flower delivery." Ruby propped her broom against the storefront and hurried inside, the stranger temporarily forgotten in the face of immediate responsibilities. The O'Malley siblings worked in companionable silence, transferring sacks of flour from the delivery wagon to the storeroom. Patrick, 4 years Ruby's senior, had managed the store alone since their parents had died of influenza 3 winters ago. At 26, he had the weathered look of a man who'd shouldered adult responsibilities too early. "Sheriff Tanner came by earlier," Patrick said casually as they stacked the last sack. "Says there's a new fellow in town, a cowboy looking for work at one of the ranches." Ruby nodded, brushing flour dust from her apron. "Just thought you should know," Patrick continued. New faces can be unpredictable. She understood his concern. Strangers often didn't know how to interact with her, and their confusion frequently turned to mockery or worse. Patrick was always vigilant, always protective. I saw him, Ruby said, her voice soft but clear. He has kind hands. Patrick raised an eyebrow. Kind hands, the way he handles his horse. Gentle, not rough. Ruby's observations of people often focused on details others missed. His horse trusts him. Patrick considered this. Well, that's something, I suppose. Still, best to keep your distance until we know more about him. Ruby didn't argue, but she filed away her impression of the stranger's kind hands in her mind alongside her other carefully collected observations about people. Later that afternoon, while Patrick was busy with customers, Ruby slipped out the back door of the store. She needed a moment of quiet, away from the clatter of commerce and conversation that sometimes became overwhelming. Her favorite refuge was a small clearing behind the livery stable where wildflowers grew in abundance. As she rounded the corner of the stable, she was surprised to find the clearing already occupied. The stranger from earlier was there, crouched beside his mare, examining one of her front hooves. The horse stood patiently, seemingly unconcerned. Ruby hesitated, torn between retreating and continuing to her sanctuary. Before she could decide, the man looked up and spotted her. "Afternoon, miss," he said, his voice deep but not loud. He set the horse's hoof down gently and straightened. Ruby remained frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't just blue but had flecks of gray in them, like the sky before a storm. "I'm Ethan Wilcox," he continued when she didn't respond. "Just checking Sadie's shoe here. Think she picked up a stone somewhere outside town." Ruby glanced at the horse, then back at the man. "Is she hurt?" The words came out in a rush of genuine concern. Something in Ethan's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise followed by a warm smile. "No, she's fine now. Just needed to clear out a bit of debris." He patted the mare's neck. "You like horses?" Ruby nodded, taking a small step forward. "They're honest." Ethan's smile deepened, creating crinkles at the corners of his eyes. "That they are. More honest than most people, I'd say." This unexpected echo of her own thoughts emboldened Ruby. She moved closer to the mare, extending her hand slowly. "May I?" "Of course." Sadie's gentle as they come. Ruby ran her hand along the horse's smooth neck, feeling the warmth and steady pulse beneath the sleek coat. Sadie huffed softly and leaned slightly into Ruby's touch. "She likes you," Ethan observed. "I like her too," Ruby replied, continuing to stroke the mare's neck. Then, in a rare moment of openness with a stranger, she added, "I'm Ruby O'Malley. My brother and I run the general store." "Pleased to meet you properly, Miss O'Malley," Ethan said, tipping his hat. "I just rode in today, looking for work." "With the cattle?" Ruby asked, knowing that several ranches in the area were always in need of experienced hands. Ethan shook his head. "No, not cattle, horses. I train them." There was pride in his voice as he added, "Have a way with the difficult ones, the ones others give up on." Ruby considered this. "There's the Morgan place," she offered. 3 miles west. They raise horses." Ethan's eyes lit up. "Is that so? I'll have to ride out there tomorrow." He studied her face curiously. "You've been mighty helpful, Miss O'Malley. I'm obliged." Ruby felt her cheeks grow warm under his gaze. She wasn't used to being found helpful by strangers. Usually, people grew impatient with her deliberate speech and tendency to avoid eye contact. "Ruby." Patrick's voice called from behind the store. "Ruby, where are you?" "I should go," Ruby said quickly, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from Sadie's neck. Ethan nodded. "Thank you for the information about the Morgan place." Ruby hurried back toward the store, glancing over her shoulder once to see Ethan watching her go, an unreadable expression on his face. Patrick was waiting by the back door, his forehead creased with worry. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere." His eyes narrowed as he spotted Ethan in the distance. "Were you talking to that stranger?" "His name is Ethan Wilcox," Ruby said. "He trains horses." Patrick frowned. "Ruby, you know you shouldn't wander off and talk to people you don't know." The familiar frustration welled up in Ruby's chest. At 22, she was a grown woman, yet Patrick insisted on treating her like a child who needed constant supervision. She understood his protectiveness came from love, but sometimes it felt like just another kind of cage. "His horse is named Sadie," she said instead of arguing. "She had a stone in her hoof, but she's better now." Patrick sighed, his expression softening slightly. "Just be careful, Ruby. Not everyone understands. Well, they don't always see how special you are." Ruby nodded, though she knew what Patrick really meant. Not everyone was patient with her differences. Not everyone was kind. But Ethan Wilcox had kind hands. And somehow, that seemed important. The following day, while helping a customer select fabric for a new dress, Ruby overheard Sheriff Tanner speaking with Patrick near the counter. "That new fellow, Wilcox, he rode out to the Morgan place this morning," Tanner was saying. "Harold Morgan told me he hired him on the spot after seeing how he handled that wild stallion they've been having trouble with." "Is that so?" Patrick's tone was neutral, but Ruby recognized the hint of skepticism beneath it. "Apparently, the man's got quite a reputation with horses," Tanner continued. "Came from Wyoming originally, worked at some big ranch up there until the owner died and the place was sold off." Ruby carefully folded a length of calico, her ears attuned to the conversation despite appearing focused on her task. "What brought him to Canon City?" Patrick asked. Tanner shrugged. "Looking for a fresh start, I reckon, like most who end up here." Canon City had its share of people seeking new beginnings. Some were running from the law, others from personal tragedies or failures. Ruby wondered what kind of fresh start Ethan Wilcox was searching for. Later that week, Ruby encountered Ethan again while delivering a package to the livery stable. He was in one of the paddocks, working with a dappled gray horse that pranced nervously around him. Ruby paused to watch, fascinated by the silent communication between man and animal. Ethan moved with confidence but without aggression, his body language calm and deliberate. The gray horse gradually settled, its initial skittishness giving way to cautious curiosity. "You're good with him," Ruby said, when Ethan finally noticed her standing by the fence. Ethan smiled, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's coming along. Been mishandled, this one, makes him distrustful." Ruby nodded in understanding. "People can be cruel when they don't understand." Something flickered across Ethan's face, recognition, perhaps. "That's exactly it," he said. "Cruelty often comes from ignorance." He approached the fence, leaving the horse to graze peacefully. "How are you today, Miss O'Malley?" "Ruby," she corrected him softly. "Just Ruby is fine." "Ruby, then," he agreed. His gaze was direct but not demanding. "I wanted to thank you for telling me about the Morgan place. It's a good fit." "I'm glad," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the gray horse nibble at the sparse grass in the paddock. "Would you like to meet him?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Thunder, I mean." Ruby hesitated. Patrick wouldn't approve of her spending time with Ethan, but her curiosity about the horse won out. "Yes, please." Ethan opened the gate and gestured for her to enter. "Move slowly and let him come to you," he advised. Ruby stepped into the paddock, keeping her movements gentle and deliberate. The horse, Thunder, raised his head to study her with wary eyes. "He's beautiful," Ruby murmured. "He is," Ethan agreed. "And smart, too. Just needs to learn to trust again." Ruby stood still, letting the horse decide whether to approach. After a few moments, curiosity overcame Thunder's caution, and he took a few tentative steps toward her. "He likes you," Ethan said, echoing his words from their first meeting. Ruby slowly raised her hand, palm up, offering it to Thunder. The horse stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. Then, with surprising gentleness, he pressed his velvety muzzle against her palm. A smile spread across Ruby's face, a rare, unguarded expression of joy. "You have a way with them," Ethan observed. "Most people don't have the patience to let animals come to them on their own terms." "Most people want everything right away," Ruby replied, still focused on Thunder. "They don't understand that trust takes time." When she finally looked up, she found Ethan watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a kind of wondering admiration that Ruby had never experienced before. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. They both turned to see Patrick striding toward the paddock, his face taut with concern. "Ruby, I've been looking all over for you," he called out. "Mrs. Peterson said she saw you heading this way." Ruby reluctantly withdrew her hand from Thunder's muzzle. "I was delivering Mr. Thompson's package," she explained, gesturing to the bundle she'd set down by the fence. Patrick's gaze shifted to Ethan, his expression cooling. "Mr. Wilcox." "Mr. O'Malley," Ethan returned with a respectful nod. "Your sister was just helping me with this horse. She has quite a gift." Patrick's stance remained rigid. "Ruby, we need to get back to the store. It's getting busy." Ruby knew it wasn't true. Tuesday afternoons were typically slow, but she recognized the protective edge in her brother's voice. She said goodbye to Thunder with a final gentle stroke of his neck, then to Ethan with a shy nod before following Patrick back toward Main Street. "I don't want you spending time alone with that man," Patrick said once they were out of earshot. "He's kind," Ruby protested. "And he understands horses." Patrick sighed. "Ruby, you know how people talk. I'm just trying to protect your reputation." "From what?" Ruby asked, a rare spark of defiance in her voice. "From someone treating me like a person instead of something broken." Patrick stopped walking, his expression stricken. "Is that how you think I see you? As broken?" Ruby looked away. "Not you, but everyone else. The whole town." Patrick reached for her hand. "Ruby, look at me." When she did, he continued softly, "You're not broken. You're different, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just worry because the world isn't always kind to people who don't fit neatly into its expectations." Ruby understood her brother's fear. She shared it, had lived with it her entire life. But something about Ethan Wilcox made her want to be brave. "He doesn't treat me like I'm simple," she said quietly. "He listens when I speak." Patrick's expression was troubled, but he squeezed her hand gently. "Just be careful, Ruby. That's all I ask." As the weeks passed, Ethan became a familiar figure in Canon City. He rented a small cabin on the edge of town and split his time between working at the Morgan Ranch and taking on additional training jobs from other horse owners in the area. His reputation as a skilled trainer spread quickly, and even Patrick had to acknowledge the man seemed to be making an honest living. Ruby encountered Ethan regularly, sometimes at the livery, sometimes when he came into the general store for supplies. Each time, he greeted her with genuine warmth and treated her with a respect that was sadly uncommon in her interactions with others. Despite Patrick's initial concerns, he couldn't maintain his suspicion in the face of Ethan's consistent courtesy. Gradually, Patrick's stance softened from outright opposition to cautious acceptance, especially after Ethan helped him repair the store's leaking roof one Sunday afternoon. Ruby, for her part, found herself looking forward to Ethan's visits to the store. He never rushed her when she needed time to organize her thoughts, never filled her silences with nervous chatter, and most remarkably never spoke to her as if she were a child. Instead, he engaged her in real conversations about horses, the changing seasons, books they had both read. It was during one such conversation in mid-July that Ruby first noticed the shift in how some of the townsfolk regarded her. She and Ethan were discussing a copy of Treasure Island he had borrowed from her when Mrs. Whittaker entered the store. The older woman, who served as Canon City's self-appointed arbiter of propriety, observed their animated conversation with narrowed eyes. Instead of her usual practice of addressing Patrick or ignoring Ruby entirely, Mrs. Whittaker approached them directly. "Mr. Wilcox," she said with a tight smile, "how nice to see you taking an interest in our Ruby's situation." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Situation, madam?" "Well, her condition, of course," Mrs. Whittaker said, lowering her voice as if Ruby couldn't hear her standing right there. "It's very charitable of you to spend time with her." Ruby felt the familiar burn of shame and anger rising in her chest. Before she could retreat behind her usual wall of silence, Ethan spoke. "There's nothing charitable about enjoying a stimulating conversation about literature, Mrs. Whittaker," he said, his tone pleasant but firm. "Ruby has insights about Jim Hawkins' moral dilemmas that I hadn't considered before. I'd say I'm the one benefiting from our discussions." Mrs. Whittaker's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She fumbled for a response, then huffed and turned away, muttering something about needing flour. Ruby stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the counter. No one had ever defended her so directly, so publicly before. "I apologize if I spoke out of turn," Ethan said quietly. "But I can't abide rudeness masked as concern." Ruby finally looked up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "No need for thanks, I only spoke the truth." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "You see things others miss, Ruby. That's not a failing, it's a gift." Something warm unfurled in Ruby's chest at his words, a feeling she couldn't immediately identify. Later, lying in bed that night, she recognized it as the unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen. As summer progressed toward autumn, Ethan became a frequent visitor to the O'Malley home. Patrick, seeing how his sister blossomed in Ethan's company, had extended an invitation to Sunday dinners, which Ethan gratefully accepted. These meals became the highlight of Ruby's week. She took special care with the cooking on Sundays, incorporating herbs from her garden and recipes their mother had taught her. Ethan always complimented her cooking with genuine appreciation, and the three of them would linger at the table long after the meal was finished, trading stories and opinions. One Sunday in early September, Patrick was called away to help with an emergency at the church. A fallen tree had damaged the roof, and as one of the few men in town with carpentry skills, his assistance was needed. He left Ruby and Ethan sitting on the porch, assuring them he would return as soon as possible. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink. Ruby had never felt this comfortable with anyone outside her family before. With Ethan, she didn't feel the constant pressure to be normal, to hide the parts of herself that others found strange or troubling. "May I ask you something, Ruby?" Ethan said finally, his voice gentle in the gathering dusk. Ruby nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Why do you let them call you simple-minded?" The question wasn't accusatory, merely curious. Ruby considered her answer carefully. "It's easier," she said at last. "If they think I'm simple, they expect less. They don't get angry when I don't look them in the eye or when I need more time to answer questions." Ethan turned to face her more directly. "But it's not the truth, is it?" Ruby shook her head slowly. "No, I'm not simple. I just see and feel things differently." She paused, then added, "Too much sometimes. Everything is louder, brighter, stronger." Ethan nodded as if this made perfect sense to him, like a horse that's high-strung, not broken, just more sensitive to the world around it. The comparison struck Ruby as so apt that she smiled. "Yes, exactly like that. You know," Ethan said thoughtfully, "my younger sister Emma was similar in some ways. She felt everything deeply: joy, sorrow, even the texture of certain fabrics against her skin. People often misunderstood her, thought her difficult or strange." Ruby's attention sharpened. A shadow passed over Ethan's face. "She died 3 years ago, influenza." He looked down at his hands. "She was 20 when we lost her." "I'm sorry," Ruby said softly. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "Our parents died of influenza too." 3 winters ago. Ethan nodded. "Patrick mentioned that. It's a cruel disease." He was quiet for a moment, then continued, "Emma was the reason I started working with horses, you know. She loved them, and they responded to her in a way they didn't with others. She taught me to be patient, to listen without words." Ruby felt a connection forming between them, a bridge of shared understanding. "That's why you don't think I'm strange," she realized aloud. "Because of Emma." Ethan's gaze was warm as it met hers. "I don't think you're strange at all, Ruby." "Different, yes, but in the best possible way. You notice things others miss, feel things others can't. How could that ever be a flaw?" In that moment, with the last light of day gilding Ethan's features and his words wrapping around her like a protective blanket, Ruby felt something shift inside her. The seed of feeling that had been growing since their first meeting blossomed into something she could no longer ignore or misname. She was falling in love with Ethan Wilcox. The realization should have frightened her. Love was complicated and messy, filled with expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. But sitting beside Ethan in the gathering darkness, Ruby felt only a profound sense of rightness, as if a puzzle piece she hadn't known was missing had finally slotted into place. Before she could examine this new awareness further, Patrick returned, apologizing for his absence. The moment passed, but the feeling remained, taking root in Ruby's heart. As autumn painted the surrounding mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold, Canon City prepared for its annual Harvest Festival. The event was the social highlight of the year, bringing in families from outlying farms and ranches for a day of competitions, food, music, and dancing. Ruby usually avoided the festival, finding the crowds and noise overwhelming. But this year, when Ethan asked if she would accompany him, she found herself agreeing despite her misgivings. "We don't have to stay the whole time," he assured her. "And if it becomes too much, we can find a quiet spot away from the crowds." His understanding of her needs without her having to explain them was yet another reason Ruby's feelings for him continued to deepen. The day of the festival arrived bright and clear, with just enough crispness in the air to remind everyone that winter wasn't far behind. Ruby wore her best dress, a deep blue calico that brought out the amber flecks in her brown eyes, and Patrick looked on with a mixture of pride and concern as Ethan arrived to escort her. "Take care of her," Patrick said, his tone making it more than a casual remark. "I will," Ethan promised, offering Ruby his arm. The town square had been transformed for the occasion. Stalls lined the perimeter, offering everything from fresh baked pies to handcrafted items. A space had been cleared in the center for dancing, with a small band setting up on a makeshift stage. Children ran about playing games, their laughter carried on the autumn breeze. Ruby tensed as they approached the growing crowd, but Ethan's steady presence beside her provided an anchor. He guided her first to the less populated areas, letting her acclimate gradually to the bustling atmosphere. They paused at a stall selling handmade quilts, and Ruby ran her fingers appreciatively over the intricate stitching. "These are beautiful," she murmured. "They are," Ethan agreed. "My mother was a quilter, said every stitch told part of a story." Ruby nodded, understanding the sentiment perfectly. "Like constellations," she said. "Each star is just a point of light, but together they make pictures, tell tales." Ethan smiled at the comparison. "I never thought of it that way, but you're right." He studied her face for a moment. "You see the connections between things, don't you? Patterns others miss." Before Ruby could respond, they were interrupted by a group of young women approaching, led by Sophia Green, the banker's daughter and one of Canon City's acknowledged beauties. "Mr. Wilcox," Sophia greeted him with a coquettish smile, barely acknowledging Ruby. "How lovely to see you at the festival. Will you be joining the dancing later?" Ethan's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Good afternoon, Miss Green, ladies," he replied politely. "I'm enjoying the festival with Miss O'Malley." Sophia's smile dimmed slightly as her gaze flicked dismissively over Ruby. "How charitable of you," she said, echoing Mrs. Whittaker's earlier sentiment, "though I'm sure Ruby wouldn't mind if you saved a dance for one of us." "The poor dear probably doesn't dance anyway." The casual cruelty of the remark hung in the air. Ruby felt herself shrinking inward, the familiar desire to disappear washing over her. Ethan's voice, when he spoke, was controlled but carried an edge Ruby had never heard before. "Actually, Miss Green, I've already promised all my dances to Ruby, and there's nothing charitable about spending time with someone whose company I genuinely enjoy." He placed his hand protectively over Ruby's where it rested on his arm. "If you'll excuse us, I believe the apple cider is ready." He guided Ruby away, leaving Sophia and her friends staring after them. Once they were out of earshot, Ethan stopped and turned to face Ruby. "I apologize for speaking for you," he said, genuine regret in his eyes. "That was presumptuous of me." Ruby shook her head. "No one has ever defended me like that before," she said softly. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "Did you mean it? About the dancing?" A smile spread slowly across Ethan's face. "Every word," he assured her. "Though I should probably ask properly. Ruby O'Malley, would you do me the honor of dancing with me today?" Ruby hesitated. "I'm not very good at dancing. Too many people, too much noise." "We could wait until later when the crowd thins out," Ethan suggested. "Or we could find our own spot, away from everyone else." The thoughtfulness of his offer touched her deeply. "I'd like that," she said. As the day progressed, Ruby found herself enjoying the festival more than she'd anticipated. Ethan stayed attentive to her comfort, noticing when the noise or crowds became too much and suggesting breaks away from the busiest areas. They sampled apple cider and freshly baked bread, watched the children's sack races, and admired the produce displayed for judging. Late in the afternoon, as the golden light of autumn began to soften, Ethan led Ruby to a quiet spot behind the schoolhouse. The music from the square was still audible but muted, and they were alone except for a few birds searching for crumbs. "May I have this dance, Miss O'Malley?" Ethan asked, executing a formal bow that made Ruby smile. She nodded, allowing him to take one of her hands in his and place his other hand lightly at her waist. With gentle guidance, he began leading her in a simple waltz. Ruby was tentative at first, afraid of stepping on his feet or losing the rhythm. But Ethan was patient, his movements clear and predictable, giving her the security she needed to relax into the dance. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured as they turned slowly in time to the distant music. Ruby's heart swelled at the praise. For once, she didn't feel awkward or out of place. In Ethan's arms, moving to the gentle cadence of the waltz, she felt graceful and whole. As the music faded and they slowed to a stop, Ethan didn't immediately step away. Instead, he looked down at Ruby with an expression that made her breath catch. "Ruby," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." The seriousness in his tone sent a flutter of anxiety through her. "Is something wrong?" "No," he assured her quickly. "Nothing's wrong, it's just—" He took a deep breath. "These past months getting to know you have been the happiest I've had in years. You've come to mean a great deal to me." Ruby stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. "You've come to mean a great deal to me too," she whispered. Ethan's eyes brightened. "Have I?" When she nodded, he continued, "Ruby, I know this might seem sudden and I don't want to rush you, but I think I'm falling in love with you." The words sent a wave of warmth through Ruby's entire being. "You are." "I am," he confirmed, a smile spreading across his face. "Completely and thoroughly." Ruby felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she admitted, the words coming easier than she'd expected. Ethan's smile grew even wider. "May I kiss you, Ruby O'Malley?" Ruby nodded, her heart racing as Ethan leaned down and gently pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft and sweet, a promise rather than a demand. When he pulled back, Ruby felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world, realigning everything around this new axis of shared feeling. They returned to the festival hand in hand, a visible declaration of their changing relationship. Ruby was aware of the glances and whispers that followed them, but for once, she didn't feel diminished by the attention. With Ethan beside her, the opinions of others seemed to matter less. Patrick noticed the change immediately when they returned to where he was helping with the pie judging. His eyebrows rose at their clasped hands, and he shot Ethan a questioning look. "I'd like to speak with you later, if that's all right," Ethan said to Patrick, his tone respectful but determined. Patrick nodded, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. "After the festival," he agreed. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of happiness for Ruby. She and Ethan participated in more of the festivities, including the communal dinner as twilight fell. When the evening grew cool, Ethan draped his jacket over her shoulders, the gesture both protective and tender. As promised, Ethan spoke privately with Patrick once they had escorted Ruby home. She waited nervously in the kitchen, unable to hear their conversation but imagining the protective questions Patrick would be asking. When they finally joined her, both men looked serious but not angry. Patrick cleared his throat. "Ethan has asked my blessing to court you properly," he told Ruby. "I've given it, with certain conditions." Ruby looked between them, her heart in her throat. "What conditions?" "That he continues to treat you with the respect you deserve," Patrick said. "That he understands that courting doesn't guarantee anything. And that he recognizes you're perfectly capable of making your own decisions." This last condition surprised Ruby. Patrick had always been protective, sometimes to the point of being controlling. His acknowledgement of her autonomy represented a significant shift. Ethan nodded solemnly. "I agreed to all these terms readily," he told Ruby. "Especially the last one. I know you can make your own choices, Ruby. I just hope I might be one of them." The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. "You are," she assured him. "You definitely are." The weeks that followed were the happiest of Ruby's life. Ethan called on her regularly, taking her for walks by the river, bringing her books he thought she might enjoy, and always treating her with a respect that made her feel valued and understood. Their courtship didn't go unnoticed in Canon City. Opinions varied widely about the relationship between the simple-minded O'Malley girl and the newcomer horse trainer. Some, like Sheriff Tanner and the Morgans, approved of the match, having witnessed firsthand how Ethan's presence had helped Ruby come out of her shell. Others, led by Mrs. Whittaker and the Green family, viewed it with suspicion or outright disapproval. The rumors and speculation reached a breaking point one crisp October afternoon at the general store. Ruby was working alone while Patrick made deliveries when Mrs. Whittaker and Mrs. Green entered, accompanied by several other women from the town's social circle. Ruby tensed but greeted them politely, continuing to organize a display of canned goods. "We've come to have a word with you, Ruby," Mrs. Whittaker announced, her tone making it clear this wasn't a friendly visit. Ruby set down the can she was holding and turned to face them, trying to control the anxiety rising in her chest. "It's about Mr. Wilcox," Mrs. Green continued. "We're concerned that you might not fully understand his attentions." "I understand perfectly," Ruby said, her voice quiet but steady. Mrs. Whittaker's eyebrows rose. "Do you? Because men like Mr. Wilcox, handsome, capable men, don't typically pursue women with your limitations, unless they have ulterior motives." The implication was clear, and it cut Ruby deeply. These women believed Ethan could only be interested in her for improper reasons or out of pity. "What my daughter means," Mrs. Green interjected, referring to Sophia, who wasn't present, "is that we worry he might be taking advantage of your innocence." Ruby felt a familiar sensation building inside her, the overwhelming flood of emotions that sometimes became too much to contain. But instead of retreating into silence as she usually did, she found words rising to her defense. "Ethan doesn't pity me," she said, her voice stronger than any of them had likely ever heard it. "And he's not taking advantage. He really sees me for who I am, not who you think I am." Mrs. Whittaker's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Ruby, dear, you simply don't have the experience to judge a man's character or intentions." "And you do." The deep voice from the doorway made all the women turn. Ethan stood there, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. Beside him was Patrick, whose face had gone pale with anger. "Ladies," Patrick said coldly, "I think you've said enough." Mrs. Whittaker drew herself up indignantly. "We were merely expressing concern for Ruby's welfare." "No," Ethan said, stepping into the store. "You were insulting her intelligence and questioning her worth." His voice was controlled but vibrated with intensity. "You call her simple-minded, but she understands kindness better than all of you. She sees goodness where you see only differences to fear or mock." The women fell silent, taken aback by his vehemence. "Ruby O'Malley," Ethan continued, turning to face her directly, "is the most remarkable person I've ever known. She notices things others miss, feels things others can't comprehend, and possesses a compassion that puts the rest of us to shame." He looked back at the assembled women. "And I consider myself the fortunate one that she returns my affections." A profound silence followed his declaration. Ruby stood motionless behind the counter, overwhelmed by Ethan's defense of her. Finally, Mrs. Green cleared her throat. "Well," she said stiffly, "we've obviously misunderstood the situation. Come, ladies." They filed out of the store, their dignity somewhat intact but their purpose thoroughly defeated. Once they were gone, Ruby let out a shaky breath. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. Ethan crossed to the counter and took her hands in his. "Yes, I did," he insisted, "because every word was true." Patrick watched them for a moment, then discreetly moved to the back of the store, giving them a measure of privacy. "No one's ever stood up for me like that before," Ruby said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then it's long overdue," Ethan replied, "and I'll keep doing it for as long as you'll let me." He hesitated, then asked, "Ruby, may I ask you something important?" She nodded, her heart beginning to race. Ethan took a deep breath. "I know we haven't been courting long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Ruby O'Malley, will you marry me?" The world seemed to still around them. Ruby looked into Ethan's eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and love reflected there. In that moment, all her doubts and fears receded before the certainty that this man, this kind, patient, understanding man, truly loved her for exactly who she was. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The joy that illuminated Ethan's face at her answer was a sight Ruby knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He lifted her hands to his lips and kissed them reverently. "You've made me the happiest man in Colorado," he said. Their engagement announcement sent ripples through Canon City. Many were genuinely pleased for the couple, especially those who had observed their relationship develop and seen the positive changes in Ruby. Others were more grudging in their acceptance, though Ethan's public defense of Ruby had silenced the most vocal critics. Patrick, after his initial protective hesitation, became Ethan's strongest advocate. He helped the couple plan for their future, offering the upstairs rooms of their house as temporary lodging while Ethan saved to build a home of their own. "The store will always be here for both of you," Patrick assured them. "Ruby, you know this place is as much yours as mine." Ruby was touched by her brother's generosity. "Thank you, Patrick, for everything." The wedding was set for early December, before the worst of winter set in. Ruby, who normally avoided being the center of attention, found herself surprisingly excited about the preparations. With help from Mrs. Morgan and several other supportive women from town, she created a simple but beautiful wedding dress from ivory fabric, ordered specially from Denver. Ethan, meanwhile, worked extra hours at the Morgan Ranch and took on additional training jobs, determined to provide well for his future bride. He also spent time improving the upstairs rooms of the O'Malley house, making them more comfortable for married life. One evening in late November, as the wedding day drew near, Ethan took Ruby for a walk despite the chill in the air. The first snow of the season had fallen the day before, dusting Canon City in a thin layer of white that sparkled in the moonlight. "I have something to show you," Ethan said, leading her to the outskirts of town. They stopped at a small plot of land overlooking a bend in the Arkansas River. In the moonlight, Ruby could make out the outline of a foundation that had been recently laid. "What is this?" she asked, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Ethan's eyes shone with excitement. "Our home," he said. "Or it will be, come spring. I purchased the land last week and we started the foundation yesterday." He squeezed her gloved hand. "Patrick helped me pick the spot. He said you always loved the view of the river from here." Ruby was speechless. She had often come to this very spot when she needed solitude and peace, drawn by the way the mountains reflected in the river's surface. "You like it?" Ethan asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. In answer, Ruby stood on tiptoe and kissed him. "It's perfect," she whispered against his lips. Ethan wrapped his arms around her, holding her close against the cold. "I want to build a life with you here, Ruby. A good life." "We already are," she assured him. Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day where the sun shines brightly but offers little warmth. The small church was filled with well-wishers more than Ruby had expected, evidence of how the town's perception of her had begun to shift. As Patrick escorted her down the aisle, Ruby felt none of the anxiety she had feared. Instead, a profound sense of rightness settled over her as she approached Ethan, who waited for her with undisguised adoration. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. When the time came to exchange vows, Ruby's voice was clear and unwavering as she promised to love Ethan for all her days. Ethan, in turn, pledged not only his love but his understanding and partnership, words chosen specifically to honor Ruby's unique way of experiencing the world. "I promise to be your shelter when the world is too loud," he vowed. Your companion when you wish to explore it, and your constant advocate always." There wasn't a dry eye in the church as the minister pronounced them husband and wife. Ethan's kiss was tender yet filled with promise, a beginning rather than an ending. The celebration afterward was held at the town hall, transformed by evergreen boughs and lanterns into a festive space. Ruby, who had worried about feeling overwhelmed by the crowd, found that with Ethan beside her, she could manage the stimulation better than she'd expected. When it became too much, he noticed immediately and created quiet moments for her to recover her equilibrium. As evening fell, the newlyweds slipped away to begin their life together in the rooms above the general store. Patrick had gifted them with a new quilt for their bed, handmade by Mrs. Morgan and reminiscent of the ones Ethan's mother had once created. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wilcox," Ethan said softly as he carried Ruby across the threshold. The name was still new to her ears, but it felt right, like a garment tailored perfectly to fit. "It feels strange," she admitted, "but good strange." Ethan set her down gently. "Many things will be new for a while," he acknowledged, "but we'll find our way together." That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Ruby marveled at how her life had transformed in less than a year. From a woman defined by others' limited perceptions to a bride cherished for her true self, the journey seemed almost unbelievable. "What are you thinking?" Ethan murmured, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "That I never thought I could be this happy," Ruby answered honestly. "That I never thought someone could love me as I am." Ethan propped himself up on one elbow to look at her in the moonlight filtering through the window. "Ruby Wilcox, loving you as you are is the easiest thing I've ever done, and the most rewarding." The winter months passed in a blur of quiet contentment as Ruby and Ethan settled into married life. They established routines that accommodated Ruby's needs while building a partnership of equals. Ethan continued his work with horses, while Ruby helped Patrick at the store and began to take a more public role in its operation, gradually gaining confidence in her interactions with customers. Word of Ethan's skill with troubled horses spread beyond Canon City, bringing clients from as far away as Pueblo and Colorado Springs. By February, he had established enough of a reputation that he could be selective about the training jobs he accepted, allowing him more time to work on their house. The foundation laid before their wedding had expanded into a frame structure by March, with Ethan and Patrick working on it whenever weather permitted. Ruby often joined them, bringing food and helping with smaller tasks. She took particular interest in planning the garden that would surround the house, envisioning a space that would provide both food and beauty. As spring arrived, bringing new growth to the mountains around Canon City, Ruby discovered she was carrying new life as well. The realization that she was to become a mother filled her with both joy and trepidation. "What if our child is like me?" she asked Ethan one evening as they sat on the porch of their partially completed home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Ethan took her hand, his expression serious but loving. "If our child sees the world as you do, then they will have the advantage you didn't, parents who understand and celebrate their unique perspective." He squeezed her fingers gently. "And if not, they'll still have the blessing of your compassion and insight to guide them." Ruby leaned her head against his shoulder, comforted by his unwavering acceptance. "You always know what to say." "Only because you've taught me how to listen," he replied. The news of Ruby's pregnancy was met with genuine congratulations from most of Canon City's residents. Even Mrs. Whitaker managed a grudgingly sincere good wish when she encountered Ruby at church. The transformation in how the town regarded her hadn't happened overnight, but the change was undeniable. Sheriff Tanner perhaps summed it up best when when he stopped by the store one afternoon in April. "You know," he said to Patrick while Ruby helped a customer nearby, "I always thought folks were wrong about your sister. She sees things differently, sure, but there's nothing simple about her mind. Takes a special kind of intelligence to understand animals and people the way she does." He nodded toward Ruby. "Ethan Wilcox saw it right away. Rest of us are just catching up." By summer, Ruby and Ethan had moved into their new home, though some finishing work remained to be done. The house was modest but thoughtfully designed, with large windows to capture the mountain views and a covered porch where Ruby could sit and watch the river. Inside, Ethan had built furnishings that combined practicality with beauty, including a rocking chair specifically for Ruby's use during her pregnancy and after the baby's arrival. The garden Ruby had planned flourished under her care, producing vegetables for their table and flowers that attracted hummingbirds and butterflies. She spent peaceful hours tending it, finding the connection with growing things both calming and fulfilling. As her pregnancy progressed, Ruby found that the physical changes brought challenges to her heightened sensitivities. Certain smells became overwhelming, and the baby's movements sometimes triggered sensory discomfort. But Ethan was endlessly patient, learning to recognize her needs often before she voiced them and creating strategies to help her cope. On a warm September evening, as they sat together on their porch watching fireflies dance above the river, Ethan placed his hand gently on Ruby's rounded belly. "I've been thinking about names," he said. Ruby covered his hand with her own, feeling their child move beneath their joined fingers. "What names do you like? If it's a boy, I thought maybe Patrick after your brother," Ethan suggested. "And if it's a girl," he hesitated. "Would you consider Emma, after my sister?" Ruby's heart swelled with love for this man who honored her family and kept his sister's memory alive. "Emma Wilcox," she said softly, testing the name. "It's beautiful, and Patrick for a boy, I'd like that very much." Ethan leaned over to kiss her gently. "Thank you," he whispered against her lips. The baby, a boy they named Patrick Thomas Wilcox, arrived on a crisp October day as the aspen trees turned golden on the mountainsides. The birth was difficult, testing Ruby's endurance to its limits, but Ethan remained by her side throughout, his steady presence an anchor in the storm of sensation and pain. When the midwife finally placed their son in Ruby's arms, exhaustion gave way to wonder. The tiny face looking up at her was perfect, with Ethan's blue eyes and a tuft of dark hair that could have come from either of them. "Hello, little Patrick," Ruby whispered, tracing a finger gently over his cheek. "We've been waiting for you." Ethan sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Ruby and his expression one of awe. "He's amazing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And so are you." As Ruby recovered from the birth, the people of Canon City demonstrated how completely their perception of her had changed. Women who had once whispered behind her back now brought meals and baby clothes, offered childcare advice, and treated her as one of their own. Even Mrs. Whittaker unbent enough to knit a blanket for little Patrick, delivering it with a grudging acknowledgement that Ruby seemed to be a natural mother. Patrick, now officially an uncle, was perhaps the most transformed of all. He doted on his nephew and spoke proudly of his sister's capabilities to anyone who would listen. The awkward, overprotective brother had become an enthusiastic supporter of Ruby's independence and growth. The first year of Patrick's life brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Ruby discovered that motherhood intensified her sensory experiences, making her sometimes feel overwhelmed by the constant demands of an infant. But she also found that her heightened awareness gave her insights into her son's needs that other mothers might have missed. Ethan, true to his word, was a partner in every sense, sharing child care and household duties without hesitation. His work with horses continued to prosper, allowing him to spend more time at home than many fathers in Canon City. Together, they created a household where differences were celebrated rather than merely tolerated. As Patrick grew from infant to toddler, Ruby watched carefully for signs that he might experience the world as she did. There were moments when his sensitivity to sounds or textures seemed familiar to her, but it was too early to know for certain. What was clear was that he was thriving under the love and acceptance that surrounded him. By the spring of 1879, 2.5 years after Ethan had first ridden into Canon City, the Wilcox family had become an established and respected part of the community. Ruby, once marginalized as simple-minded, was now sought out for her knowledge of gardening and herbal remedies. Ethan's reputation as a horse trainer had grown to the point where he could be highly selective about the jobs he accepted, allowing him to focus on the most challenging cases that utilized his special skills. Little Patrick, now a sturdy 18-month-old with his father's blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful expression, was a favorite throughout Canon City. His alert curiosity and gentle manner with animals suggested he had inherited the best qualities from both parents. On a mild May evening, as the family sat on their porch watching the sunset, a wagon approached their property. Ruby recognized it as belonging to Harold Morgan, Ethan's first employer in Canon City. "Evening, folks," Morgan called as he pulled his team to a stop. "Hope I'm not interrupting your supper." "Not at all, Harold," Ethan replied, rising to greet him. "What brings you out this way?" Morgan climbed down from the wagon with the stiffness of a man who had spent decades in the saddle. "Got a proposition for you, Ethan." "Been thinking on it for a while now." Ruby listened curiously as the rancher explained that he was getting too old to manage his horse breeding operation properly. "My sons are more interested in cattle," he said, "but I hate to see all the work I've put into developing good bloodlines go to waste." Ethan nodded, understanding where the conversation was heading. "You're looking to sell the horse operation?" "Not exactly," Morgan replied. "More like a partnership. I provide the land and existing stock, you provide the expertise and management. We split the profits." He glanced at Ruby and little Patrick. "It would mean more stability for your family and eventually a business you could call your own." The offer was unexpected but not entirely surprising. Ethan's skill with horses was unmatched in the region, and Morgan was known for his shrewd business sense. "It's a generous offer, Harold," Ethan said, "but I'd need to discuss it with Ruby before giving you an answer." Morgan nodded approvingly. "Of course you would. That's exactly why I think you're the right man for this." He tipped his hat to Ruby. "Mrs. Wilcox, I hope you'll consider it favorably. Ethan's got a gift that shouldn't be limited to training other folks' problem horses." After Morgan departed, Ruby and Ethan sat in thoughtful silence for a while, watching Patrick play with wooden blocks on the porch. "What do you think?" Ethan finally asked. Ruby considered the question carefully. "It would be a big change," she acknowledged. "More responsibility, more people to interact with." She looked out at the river, gleaming golden in the setting sun. "But it's also an opportunity to build something lasting, something that could provide for Patrick's future." Ethan reached for her hand. "We don't have to decide immediately, and whatever we choose, we decide together." Ruby squeezed his fingers. "I think you should accept," she said after another moment of reflection. "You were meant to work with horses, not just the troubled ones but all of them, and I—" She paused, a small smile forming. "I think I'm stronger than I used to believe. I can handle the changes." The pride in Ethan's eyes warmed her heart. "You're the strongest person I know, Ruby Wilcox." He leaned over to kiss her gently. "And you're right, we can do this together." The partnership with Morgan proved to be the beginning of a new chapter for the Wilcox family. Ethan's natural talent for breeding and training horses, combined with Ruby's meticulous record-keeping and eye for detail, transformed the operation into one of the most respected in Colorado within a few years. Their family grew as well. In the fall of 1880, Ruby gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Emma Rose Wilcox. Unlike her brother, Emma showed clear signs from an early age of experiencing the world, as Ruby did intensely aware of sensory input, sometimes overwhelmed by stimuli others barely noticed, but also possessing a remarkable sensitivity to the emotions and needs of those around her. Rather than fearing these traits, Ruby and Ethan embraced them, using their combined understanding to help Emma navigate the world in ways Ruby had never been taught. They created routines that provided security without rigidity, exposed her gradually to new experiences while respecting her limits, and most importantly, never treated her differences as deficiencies. As the years passed, Canon City itself seemed to grow and change alongside the Wilcox family. The arrival of the railroad brought new prosperity and new faces to the town. Some of the older prejudices began to fade, though human nature being what it was, they never disappeared entirely. Patrick O'Malley eventually married the schoolteacher who had come to Canon City in 1878, a woman named Clara, who appreciated his steady nature and kind heart. They had 3 children of their own, cousins who grew up almost as siblings to Patrick and Emma Wilcox, spending countless hours together at the general store or the Morgan Wilcox horse ranch. Ruby, whose world had once been limited to the confines of her brother's store and her small garden, found herself at the center of an expanding circle of family and friends. The woman once dismissed as simple-minded became known instead for her wisdom, her deep understanding of horses, and her uncommon insight into human nature. On a summer evening in 1886, 10 years after Ethan had first ridden into Canon City, the extended Wilcox and O'Malley families gathered at Ruby and Ethan's home to celebrate their anniversary. The house had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family and prosperity, but it retained the charm of the original structure, with its large windows overlooking the river and mountains. As twilight descended, the adults sat on the porch while the children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm evening air. Ruby, now 32 but still possessing the quiet beauty that had first caught Ethan's attention, leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in the moment. "I was thinking about the day we met," Ethan said softly, his arm around her waist. "Do you remember?" Ruby smiled. "Of course, you were checking Sadie's hoof. You had kind hands." Ethan chuckled. "And you noticed that right away. Most people wouldn't have." "Most people don't pay attention to the important things," Ruby replied. From the yard came the sound of young Emma's voice, explaining something to her cousins with the serious intensity that reminded everyone so much of Ruby. At 8 years old, she was already showing signs of her mother's perceptiveness combined with her father's confidence. Patrick, watching his sister and brother-in-law from across the porch, raised his glass in a toast. "To Ethan and Ruby," he said, "who taught Canon City that there are many kinds of intelligence and that the most important one is kindness." "To kindness," the others echoed, glasses raised. As the stars began to appear above the mountains, Ruby thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a woman defined by others' limitations to one who had helped redefine what was possible, not just for herself, but for her daughter and others like them. Canon City had once called her simple-minded, but Ethan had recognized the truth from the beginning, that her way of experiencing the world wasn't a deficiency but a different kind of wisdom, one that understood kindness better than most. And in a world often harsh and unforgiving, especially to those who were different, wasn't that the most valuable wisdom of all?